And now one of the highlights of Sunday television becomes a monitor feature presentation. Youth Wants to Know. Earlier today, teenagers from the Washington, D.C. area met in our NBC studios, there to question Judge Samuel S. Leibowitz, judge of Kings County Court of New York. Monitor was there, and we recorded every word so that we might bring you the discussion just as it took place this afternoon. Here now is the moderator of today's program, Steve McCormick.
Switchblade knives and gang fights to robbery and murder, the end result of juvenile delinquency. Today's teenagers have devised such instruments of death and violence as a harmless-looking automatic pencil capable of firing .22 caliber bullets, an attractive trinket, which in reality is a lethal switchblade knife, or an ordinary cigarette lighter converted into a deadly .22 caliber single-shot weapon. Such youngsters are the potential criminals of tomorrow. Today on Youth Wants to Know, to discuss this critical problem, we're pleased to have the Honorable Senior Judge Samuel S. Leibowitz of Brooklyn's highest criminal court, an eminent authority on juvenile delinquency. Welcome to Youth Wants to Know, Judge Leibowitz.
Steve, I've looked forward to come here and talk to the parents and the kids of America and these fine youngsters here. I dare say there isn't a juvenile delinquent among them.
Not one, but they have many questions for you, Judge. These questions and the youngsters here being here under the auspices of the National Education Association. Many questions for you, and let's begin with Marcia. Marcia Conley.
Judge Leibowitz, do you believe that punishing parents is the answer to juvenile delinquency?
No. Why? Because most of the parents who produce these juvenile delinquents themselves need psychiatric treatment and much attention. Now, what are you going to do with a mother who can hardly speak English that has 15 kids growing up in a mud gutter like weeds? How can you punish her? She's so inadequate. She's so incompetent. You get nowhere as punishing parents.
Yes, Joe.
Well, sir, what main thing...
What's that again, Joe?
What one single main thing can be done to help this situation whereby juvenile delinquents are often started by parental control?
Well, let me start out by saying this, that the vast majority of our kids in America are decent, law-abiding kids. And the percentage of juvenile delinquency is a small percentage. But small as it is, it runs into several millions per population. Now, it's a complex problem what to do about parents. My point is that you can do very little with the hardcore families, so-called, of today. They're so depraved, they're so incompetent, you just can't make them over. We had a survey in New York about a year ago, and the figures showed that out of 1 million families, only 20,000 families produced 80% of the juvenile delinquency. And there's very little you can do with those 20,000 families. They're the real problem.
Pete?
Judge Leibowitz, would you say that organized religion is falling down and aiding to prevent juvenile delinquency?
Well, we've drifted away from the houses of God, from the church and the synagogue and the temple. It's true that the attendance is large, but basically we've become a nation that worships material things, the icebox, the high-powered car, all of these gadgets that you see around the house. In other words, we've drifted away from the Word of God and the house of God, and we're worshiping these newfangled gadgets today.
Yes, Joe.
What more could the churches and the synagogues and the temples do to prevent this juvenile delinquency rate?
Well, they can do much. If they start with the young parents, the young people that are about to get married and that are about to bring children into the world. You see, the youngsters are idealistic. They have dreams. They are altruistic. They want good things for their children. They want to bring the coming children up in the right moral way. And my point is that if we're going to ever solve this problem, we can't center our attention solely upon the immediate young gangster and his parents. But we've got to start with the young people. We've got to start at the Marriage License Bureau by showing young people what the dangers are today, what impacts there are today upon youngsters that grow up in this crazy, mad, psychopathic world of ours.
Judge, may I ask you this question? In the current issue of Reader's Digest, there's a very interesting article called Conduct Code for Teenagers, written by Jean Block, and she points out how one Minnesota community set up a code to take care of this very problem, a code about the kind of games to play at parties, about drinking and so on. Is this a wise thing for communities to do? Will this help solve the problem?
That may help in a small community, but try to put forth a program of that kind in a teeming city like New York or Chicago or Los Angeles or some other large city.
It wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work, no, sir.
Fred.
Judge, don't you believe that one of the basic causes of the problem is the insistence of our educational system to rely upon cold knowledge and book learning instead of giving students a real philosophy of life based upon the existence of God, which we can't deny?
Well, there's always the objection to talking about God and religion in the public schools. There are two schools of thought on it, and there's a tug of war between them. They want to keep church and state, and school belongs to the latter category, apart. But the trouble is that we're not teaching our kids morality, basic morality. We're drifting away from that. The parent today, by example, shows the young child who mimics him that it's a smart thing to beat the law, a little innocuous thing like fixing a traffic ticket, or faking on the income tax returns, or smuggling some perfume on the way back from Europe. There are things like that that corrode the youngster, because bear in mind this, that a kid is not born with any morality. He's not born left-handed or right-handed. He's taught how to eat with his right hand. And so by precept, by example, the parent must set the example for the youngster as he grows up in the home. Well, and once they leave the home, it's a tough job to correct it.
Fred?
I said I definitely agree with the undeniable value of the home. But a children from the 6th to the 18th year of his life is in school almost all the time. And if the educational system completely shuns this, isn't the child lost?
Yes, the child is lost, and there's more to it than that. This progressive education is just a bunk. And it's caused a hollowcast in our public school system. I had a boy before me for being a safecracker. He was 18 years old. He went to the 8th grade in the grammar school, and this 18-year-old kid burned out combinations with acetylene torches, and he was the leader of a gang. The oldest one was 45. Now, I'm going to tell you kids something that you will not believe, but take it from me. It's the truth. It happened in my court. This 18-year-old boy who went to the 8th grade in school couldn't spell cat. What do you think of that? And so they graduate him. They push them along from class to class, whether they pass the examinations or not. And so they graduate many of them. These delinquents are absolutely illiterate. Can't even spell the word girl when they're in high school.
Phil Bowling.
Judge, what has been done about the first-time offenders being thrown in with hardened criminals and thus learning more about what's going on in the criminal world?
Oh, my gosh, that's the old cliche that the do-gooders and the crackpots and the starry-eyed reformers are passing out to the public. Let me tell you something about some of these juvenile criminals. They can teach the old crook, and they can give him cards and spades on how to commit crime and get away with it.
But
that's the juvenile criminal today, as distinguished from the hell-raising kid of years ago who committed some of the juvenile youthful peccadillos.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Annette?
Well, Judge, a moment ago you were speaking about the relationship of the schools and what they do for juvenile delinquency. Well, the problem, it seems to me, is what a kid does after he's out of school. In his leisure time, when he's through with school in the afternoon, a lot of juvenile crimes, the most part of them, are committed in the evening. What can the communities do to take care of this leisure time of the juveniles?
Now, you're talking about, are you talking about a large city or a small town?
I realize there's a difference between...
There's a vast difference.
Well, take the city of New York.
Very, very little, if anything, that can be done. All the playgrounds in the world, all the social centers in the world, all these things that are good in and of themselves are not going to solve this problem one single bit, and we're spending millions of dollars on that, and I'm for it, but it isn't going to solve the problem.
What will solve the problem?
It's as I pointed out at the beginning, and I'm sold on it after so many years of experience face to face with this problem. You've got to start with the young parent. That's where your beginning must be. And you've got to have a national education of young parents. I want to say this before I leave this topic. I want to pay my respects to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, the Catholics are doing a great job in that respect. They have what is known as the Cana conferences, where they get together all these young people whom they marry at the time the children are born or even before the children are born. And they teach them how to take care of kids in this mixed up crazy psychopathic world of ours today. There's an example that that great religion has set that others should follow.
Yes, Judge Molly Harper has a question for you.
Molly?
Judge Leibowitz, I'd like to know what effect that you believe that movies and horror television shows and obscene literature have had upon the youth of today and the potential juvenile delinquent.
They've had a terrible effect. Now, us older people can go look at these things on television or on the stage or in magazines, and we just laugh at it. We can handle it.
What could be done along this line?
Well, what can be done? If you start to, if you try to invoke a sort of a censorship, you're immediately met by the cry of freedom of the press and freedom of speech.
In an affirmative way, for instance, let's just take one. Could television do something?
Television can do much in a constructive way, and this is what I mean. Instead of merely dramatizing crime stories where you show the shooting and the murder, and you wind up at the last minute with the crook being arrested. You don't show what happens to the crook in jail, how many years of torture he must suffer. But during this period, while these exciting things are shown, the kids are excited, and they squeal in the moving picture theaters, and they cheer, and they see the punches and shootings and murders. But my point is this: what television should do, and it can do oh so much, is to show what can be done to prevent it, what can be done with parents, the help that parents must get. And this great industry that has done so much for mankind can help greatly in solving this, to my mind, the most important, pressing, perplexing problem in America today. Because we have the highest rate of delinquency in the world here, and the highest crime rate in the world, although we have the most prosperous nation in the world as compared to other countries.
Yes, Chandler Lewis.
Well, Judge Leibowitz, do you believe that Sputnik and the present state of the atomic age will have a great effect on delinquency?
Oh, my heavens, that's another shibboleth and cliche that's peddled around. War and Sputniks and Mutniks haven't got that much influence on the young gangster today.
Well,
he's not thinking of Sputnik and what's going to happen to the world. He's thinking of getting some excitement, of sitting in the pool room at the feet of some young hoodlum who's had a lot of experience and listening to tales of crime. He wants to look up to the big shot. He wants to be protected by the gang. He wants to get that vicarious thrill that kids get when they forage and engage in rumbles with other gangsters.
Yes, Chandler.
Well, with the younger children who could be potential delinquents, don't you think that this could take some of their security away, and therefore when they grew up to the age of delinquents, they
No, my dear, war has nothing to do with it, and all of these international questions have nothing to do with it. I'll tell you what has something to do with it. If you get some big shot criminal, some grafter in public life, especially on the national scene, if you mirror a degenerate who's married the 11th wife, you know who I mean, don't you? And he tosses them off like so much wet, soiled clothing every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and he pays them off, and his picture is on the front page of the tabloid. If you have a lady deserting her child, this lady that's occupied the attention of the entire cinema public of America, running off to Italy or some other place and leaving her child, deserting her child, and then having other children, you know the story that I mean. She can do what she pleases if she does it privately. But if this glamorous star, is held up to the country as a symbol, she's played roles that are a far cry from what she's done. You know the role I mean. That is a deteriorating influence on our kids because they can't handle it. And they think that's the way to live. That's glamour. That's life. These are the things that have impacts on our youngsters today that increase juvenile delinquency instead of the thought of war. Now, France, let me just say this. France has been ravaged by war. It's been laid low by war. Italy likewise, and the other European countries. But still, you don't have anywhere near as much juvenile delinquency in France and Italy and Belgium and Holland as you have in this country.
Let me go to Pete, Judge. Pete.
Judge, I wanted
Yes,
to get
Pete.
back to a question on the schools. Do you recommend that the schools have better psychological and psychiatric facilities to cope with these delinquents?
Why, certainly, but look, let's talk plain English, and let's be honest with ourselves. Take a psychiatrist. Suppose you had enough psychiatrists to put one in each school. If you go to a private psychiatrist, it would take him weeks and months to straighten out a youngster who is twisted, or an adult for that matter. How much attention can one of these psychiatrists give to a school of 2,000 people?
Judge Leibowitz, you said, however, that these degenerate kids should not be in the same classroom. I mean, I believe that's a law. Up in that area. Yeah, they shouldn't be in the same classroom with the decent kids.
Yes.
Well, how are you going to cope with these kids? You're just going to throw them out of school?
Not out of school. You take them out of the classes where the decent kids go there to learn and to be in peace. When a parent sends one of you kids to a public school, as the chief judge of our state, Judge Albert Conway, said in a recent opinion, that parent has a right to expect you to come back without being maimed by some hoodlum. Now, if there are hoodlums in the schools, take them out of the schools. Put them somewhere else. Put them in a reformatory or a special school. But hoodlums and malcontents have no place with decent kids in the same classroom.
But what preventive measures are you going to take? That's corrective, but there's no preventive there.
The only way you can prevent decent kids from being hurt and from getting their education as the law intends them to get is to take these disturbers out of these schools. There's no two ways about it. And there's no answer to it that you've got to keep them there. Put them somewhere else. That's the problem. There are a lot of things that have to be considered in that connection. But you can't let a kid that throws lie, that's crazy, and that's dangerous and a menace, to sit side by side with a decent boy or a decent girl. That's unthinkable.
Sir?
Yes, Joe?
You have said that there's a definite relationship between dungarees and the juvenile delinquent. Do you consider this to be true throughout the country or only in certain sections of the country?
Well, look, I don't know about the whole country. I'm not an expert on the whole country. I can only speak of my own town and towns like it where I've had the day-to-day experience with this problem. I don't think it's helpful towards curing the situation by having young girls walk around in these dungarees with the boots, tight dungarees, and these tight sweaters with these big earrings, painted up like little horses. Now, maybe the mothers should show by example. Some mothers, not all, should show by example that a painted-up doll parading around the street isn't a good example for a young girl.
Do you think that a youth should be allowed to wear dungarees to school?
Well, I don't. There's nothing inimically wrong about the dungaree, but it's a badge. Remember the zoot suits?
Judge, let's go over here to a young man.
The dungaree is the zoot suit of today, and the kids should be dissuaded from wearing them, especially girls.
Judge?
And this duck-bill business in the back.
Certainly girls can't wear
dungarees, which is
dungarees
typical of
to
the young
school.
sex degenerates that we know.
We have a young man from California with an idea on that Gaylord word.
Gaylord.
Well, then you believe that if jeans are neat, well-pressed, and fit well, they'd be all right for the schools, then. It's
Well, why do you
not
have to
inherent in the
where do
jeans
you have to
themselves.
wear jeans, in heaven's name? Haven't you got a pair of trousers? Can't you wear a nice clean shirt? Why do you have to mimic this chap that's wiggling all over the stage with his banjo? Why should he be the example?
I don't
Gaylord,
believe that-
you had an opinion. What is it?
I don't believe that's where the example comes from. According to Parents Magazine, almost 100% of the teenagers all over the country wear jeans at one time or another, and I don't believe this causes their attitude to change one way or another.
No, it isn't.
Just
the jeans.
neat clothes,
It
whether
is-
they're jeans or slacks.
Well,
I don't
Well,
believe
it isn't.
can-
Gaylord, excuse me. It isn't the jeans. The jeans themselves are not immoral. But what do you think of a young girl that buys a pair of jeans and then sits in a bathtub full of water and then steps out and lets the jeans dry, and so that the jeans will fit perfectly on the female form, and then sashays out into the street with a bunch of young fellows? Do you approve of that?
No, not at
Of course
all.
not.
But if they're neat, well-pressed, and clean, then you can
Gaylord,
agree that they'd
don't-
be all right for schools.
Yeah.
Don't
All right, Joe, what is
don't
it
these
then?
clean, neat pressed jeans, don't they lead to having tight jeans? You can't turn khakis into these tight fitting things, whereas I think you certainly can turn jeans in. You can't draw the line between neat jeans and unneat
Well,
jeans.
Joe's asked the
You
question,
can.
Gaylord.
Joe, if they just buy them this way, if they buy them tight, or
You
if
can
they
make
wear
'em
them
tight.
dirty,
Well,
they can do these with khakis as well as flannels.
Not
so-
as well.
Well, Judge, we stirred up a little controversy here in terms of clothing, but I noticed you did bring a few things with us that look mighty malicious there, and some pretty potent weapons. Now, what are these? Do these have some relation with juvenile delinquency?
Well, Steve, let me say this. We had wild kids when I was a youngster on the east side. I was brought up in the worst kind of a slum. But when I came into my little shabby place, which was a 2-room flat, with my mother Zalik and my father, I came into a home. There was a neighborhood there. Everybody knew everybody else. People were born on that block, they got married on that block, they raised children in that neighborhood, and they died in that neighborhood. A girl couldn't walk down the street who was a bad girl without the neighbors pointing their fingers at her. And people would cluck their tongues over the fences. But today we have no more neighborhoods, Steve. The neighborhoods have disappeared. There's only one neighborhood in the city of New York. Just bear with me for a moment.
Now we must deal with reality, Judge. We have what we have.
Well, now wait, that's Chinatown. On one side of the Bowery, where Chinatown is located, are all the gangs. On the other side, you have the Chinese people, and you haven't got any juvenile delinquency or any crime in Chinatown. Why? Because the neighborhood is still there. Now, we have no more neighborhoods. And therefore, there is very little that the people at large can do when today in the cities they're living in filing cabinets instead of in neighborhoods. The policeman has disappeared from the street. All these things have helped to make this problem which we're facing today, which we call juvenile delinquency, and which I call juvenile crime. Now, talking about these weapons, let me show
David has
you.
a question, I'm sure, probably about the weapons. Dave?
Do you believe that the weapons actually make the criminal, or the criminal makes the weapon?
Oh, the criminal makes the weapons. Let me just show you what a switchblade knife really looks like. You see this here? Let me press the button.
But, I mean...
Now, this will cut the heart out of a human being. Let me show you another thing. This is just off a garbage barrel. It can break a man's skull. Here's a zip gun manufactured by a kid. This is a knife switchblade. Here's an instrument. Here's an instrument that stabbed a boy 11 times in a gang fight. Just see how sharp these things are. They can cut a man's head in half and then slice open his belly. Just let me show you this. This was taken from a kid in a school. This contained heroin. And this was peddled by this boy to other school children at $5 a shot in the washroom of a school. Now, just look at these weapons here. Look at this thing here. This is a garrison belt, an ordinary belt, but lead has been wound around the buckle so that by striking a person on the head, you can fracture his skull. Look at this dirk that was taken from a 10-year-old kid. Look at this zip gun. Look at that one here, all manufactured by youngsters. Now, we're not dealing with juvenile delinquents that we knew years ago. We're dealing with juvenile criminals of the most sadistic type.
Well, what I mean, Judge, he's able to get a hold of these weapons.
He makes
Once
them.
he gets a hold of them, the only use it...
Some of them he makes.
Judge, do you believe that if we treated these kids as criminals, then, that this would cut down on the juvenile crime rate?
Well, there have been so many viewpoints on that matter. There's very little you can do.
What is your viewpoint?
Very little you can do with the kid that's already so steeped in depravity and in crime. I'll tell you why. If you take that kid back again to his home, it all goes back to the home. What does he find in his home? Is the home a convalescent place? Can he be cured in his home? All of these fine things, playgrounds, schools, social centers, are all fine, but the kid goes back to the place that spawned him, from which he emanated.
Well, Judge, I want to ask you another question on these weapons, the ones you brought with you, Judge, and those that we have from the Senate Juvenile Delinquency Subcommittee. Isn't there a lighter here which I understand turns into a weapon of some kind?
Oh, yes.
A cigarette lighter that becomes a weapon if certain things are done?
An ordinary cigarette lighter. The diagram is there. You can see it. And the rat that sold that for $1 a copy to kids by advertising. I don't believe in the whipping post. But if there were a whipping post, I would take a rat like that and chain him to a whipping post and whip him, because he's just as much a menace as the dope peddler that peddles dope to kids.
Well, Judge, you characterize...
Joe, hold it for a minute. Jim hasn't had a question. Jim?
With this severe punishment, Judge Leibowitz, I was wondering, has the role of the female changed from provocation to participation in juvenile delinquency?
What do you think, Gaylord?
Well, I believe that females are in the gangs more than they were
Well,
years
let's
ago.
ask this sweet little
Susan
girl
has
here.
a...
Susan, what do you think of that?
Well, I guess they have to some degree. I guess they've gotten quite worse.
Have you heard the term gun mall? There are plenty of gun malls in the town where I come from that hold these weapons for the gangsters.
Judge, what?
The other day on Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn, 6 female hoodlums, high school girls, took a young girl who wouldn't join their gang, and they beat the living daylights out of her. They almost killed her.
Yes, Susan.
Well, do you believe these criminals should be tried in an adult court?
It doesn't make any difference where you try them, but I do believe this. Where you can save the youngster, where he's made his first mistake, where it's just the beginning of it. Put him on probation and do everything you can to straighten him out. But probation after probation after probation after probation in some of these courts makes the law a farce. And they walk out into the corridor and they thumb their nose at the law and at the policemen. And they go back to their gangsters and their juvenile haunts and they say, well, we can get away with it. There's nothing to it. They'll never send us away.
Miss Molly.
Well, Judge, recently in some cases, many people have been released through legal loopholes. Do you believe that the juveniles know of these loopholes and this tends to increase their delinquency?
Well, honey, it goes back to the courts. We have some wonderful children's court judges in our town, but we have some weak sisters. And I just spoke about these repeated probations that do so much harm in spreading disrespect for law and authority. That's the answer to that.
Yes, Jim.
Oh, well, Judge Leibowitz, do you favor this secret code, then, of not publishing a minor's name who has committed offense in the paper? Is this good?
Now, look, in a small town, if you published his name, the whole community would know about it.
In a large town?
In a large city, it doesn't mean a thing because the family is so depraved that it means nothing to them to have the name in the paper. But it does something bad, and here is the answer. Now, make it brief. It does something bad. It's harmful because it gives the young criminal status in his community. He's arrived. He's seen his name in the paper. He can tell his gang leader, see, I'm a big shot now.
And he must be a hero at their
And
work.
he must be a hero.
Judge, I must interrupt. Our time is up. I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Judge Samuel Leibowitz, for being our guest today on Youth Wants to Know.
Steve, it's been a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad that I had an opportunity to speak to these fine kids, and what's even more important, to speak to the mothers and the kids of America.
Thank you, Judge. Now, this is Steve McCormick speaking for Theodore Granick and bidding you goodbye.
This is National Diabetes Week. Be sure you are not one of the million undetected diabetics. Be tested during Diabetes Week. The questions you have just heard do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Youth Wants to Know, the National Broadcasting Company, or the National Education Association. Join us again next week when Youth Wants to Know will come to you direct from New York City with a special program on modern musical trends. Our guest will be George Marek, Vice President and General Manager of RCA Victor and RCA Recording Stars, Miss Georgia Gibbs and Miss Risa Stevens. For reprints of today's discussion on Youth Wants to Know, send 10 cents to Ransdell Incorporated, Printers and Publishers, Washington 18, D.C.
This is Monitor, the NBC Weekend Radio Service.